and I would like to thank you for your time and attention joining us here today. It's great to see you all here for this 101 session. So, for those of you who have never been to a 101, it's kind of a US denoted classroom code. It basically means introduction or exposure to something new. So, Octopus 101 is a webinar series that we run every month where we give you a chance to kind of kick the tires and see Octopus from soup to nuts, basically, and see everything that it can do. We try and lay out some terminology for you to understand and provide some context for understanding Octopus Deploy in terms of doing deployments, etc. So, welcome. Thank you for joining. This is a live webinar, by the way. So, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use them in the comment section. Let us know where you're joining from. Always interesting to see where people are joining from. And also, if you want, you can feel free to follow up after this webinar and ask questions. I have an email address, which I'll share with you in a brief moment. But before we get into that, I just wanted to share with you a couple of resources. First and foremost, if you miss anything during this webinar, don't worry. Everything will be available to our YouTube channel. If you haven't liked and subscribed to our YouTube channel, as the kids say, please feel free to do so. We have a ton of webinars and videos available there, which you can check out. We publish to our YouTube channel almost daily at this point. We have a bunch of videos there you can definitely check out. And of course, all our webinars are streamed there. If you want, you can check out our website, which is at octopus.com. There you can sign up for a free trial. We'd love to have you kick the tires yourself after this webinar. And hopefully you'll have enough exposure at Octopus itself after this webinar to find out more. And then before we get into the context of today's webinar, just wanted to share with you this one resource here, which is our webinars page. You'll find us at /webinars. There you'll see a whole list of webinars that we have available, including our 101 series, which you're currently attending. This one over here is really exciting for us. This is our 2025.1 release party. So this is going to be on March 25th, and we'll feature a bunch of PMs and engineers from R&D talking about the latest release of Octopus Deploy. We would love to see you there. So feel free to participate by signing up today. We have some other ones coming up as well. We have a recap webinar for KubeCon Europe, which is taking place in London. And we, of course, have our new show called Argo Unpacked. If you're at all interested in Argo CD, Argo rollouts, etc., this one is hosted by Dan and Revital of Octopus Deploy, and they have a great little show that they've started up here called Argo Unpacked, so make sure to check that out as well. All this can be found at octopus.com/webinars. And at the bottom, you'll notice that we actually have a newsletter that you can also sign up for if you wish to get notified of new webinars as they come available. Anyways, that being said, let's jump back into our presentation and go through some of the things that we want to talk about here today. So if you have any questions, you can either post them here to the comments pane. I'm taking questions live. Or if you so choose, you can send me an email address, which is available here. I love hearing from folks, getting your questions, so feel free to let me know. I would love to hear from you. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about in this webinar. So if you haven't been to a 101, that's fine. That's okay. We'll talk about this pretty consistently. But what we're going to talk about here first is describe what is Octopus. We're going to define what it is, how it works, and why you should consider using it. So oftentimes when looking at technology, the why is not often covered. You learn about the how, you learn about the what, but you don't often learn about the why. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the why in this context. We're going to cover a whole bunch of fundamentals around Octopus itself. So we'll talk about terminologies like projects, deployment processes, releases, variables. These and other terms you'll hear, runbooks, tenants, etc. throughout the course of this webinar. Don't worry. You'll get a sense of what they all are by the end, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a comfortable understanding of what they are. They are the terminology that we use to describe things like workflows and deployments, etc. So I'll continue to harp on these terms throughout the webinar. Then we're going to go into a demo, excuse me. We're going to go into a demo and talk a little bit about creating a deployment process. This is at the heart of what Octopus does, which is defining a deployment process is the series of steps that you conduct to do a deployment. And we'll talk about how to create one from scratch. We'll also take a look at a bunch of examples. If you have any questions about what this is and how it works, etc., or you want to look at it in a particular context, feel free to let me know. Happy to adjust any sort of demos you want. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how to trigger a deployment in an automation context through a CI process or server. CI stands for continuous integration. And it's typically the way that most deployments are kicked off. It's sort of like the starting point of a lot of pipelines. Doesn't have to always be that way, of course. There are a lot of ways you can actually orchestrate a pipeline. But a CI process tends to be the most canonical one that folks tend to use, especially in a development context. So we'll take a look at that in the context of GitHub Actions. But we support a variety of CI solutions that are available in the marketplace. So to set things off, just to understand or kind of slot in where Octopus might fit in your organization, this is typically after a CI process. So on the left, you have your developers. On the right, you have your targets. In the middle, you'll have a bunch of tools. Not all of these, of course, but you might have tools like TeamCity, Jenkins, possibly Circle CI, GitHub, etc. Maybe even CodeFresh. These and other sort of CI solutions are available. And you might have some other tools as well as part of your heterogeneous pipeline. Where we see Octopus is right before your targets and right after your CI process. So this is where it slots in. It covers everything to do with your deployments, anything to do with continuous delivery, anything to do with automation of tasks, the ops side of DevOps through runbooks, which is a capability that Octopus also supports. All the auditing, the tracing, all of that stuff is all built in to Octopus itself. So understanding the why is kind of interesting because you see a lot of scenarios today where a lot of folks are building their sort of do-it-yourself sort of scripts. So without Octopus Deploy, you build out a lot of scripts. These scripts can contain a variety of variables that change from environment to an environment. Can get a bit unwieldy, can be difficult to manage. There's no single source of truth. Basically, you're trying to manage all this chaos. Whereas with Octopus Deploy, these are all well-defined in a taxonomy that is well understood, that is utilized throughout every project that you use. It's consistent, it's reliable, has built-in capabilities like rollbacks, etc. And that's why we use a solution such as Octopus Deploy. Now, thinking about this in a sort of more practical sense, the way this might look in your organization is you might utilize a source control repository based on Git, for example, very popular today, which is utilizing a CI process hosted in one of those that I mentioned earlier, Jenkins or GitLab, for example. And then from there, the chaos begins. So you have to manage a whole bunch of different environments. You might use a whole subset of tooling, kubectl. You might manage backup. You might manage infra through Terraform, Pulumi, etc. There's a lot of stuff that requires a lot of DIY sort of shadow CD that we talk about in Octopus about how you have to do it yourself for a lot of these things. It becomes unwieldy. It becomes very hard to manage and control. And that's all before you even get to the observability part of your solution or even managing your deployment targets themselves. And so the reality is that this is very difficult and it's seen very much as an afterthought in a lot of respects. With Octopus Deploy, what we try to do is we try and simplify that and make it more reliable and safe for you to do your deployments, to do your continuous delivery. And so the front end doesn't change. You're still doing source control with CI. You're still doing integration with CI solutions. But from there, you may utilize container registries. You may use package registries, etc., which we integrate with. But then once life moves, or once your pipeline moves into Octopus Deploy, there you have a whole taxonomy of things that you can use for your disposal. These are things like, release orchestration, deployment strategies, runbook automation. We have a very powerful configuration management system as well as variable management. You could employ a whole range of deployment strategies, including blue, green, canary, etc. And that is all basically independent of all the integrations we have. So we have integrations with a whole host of different tools that you can integrate as part of your deployment pipeline, which is awesome. And for us, every deployment target is just yet another target. So we do cloud, we do on-premise, we do hybrid. So you can deploy to pretty much any target you want. And Octopus will support that in a seamless and safe way. Looking at this in practical terms with a solution like GitHub, for example, this is what it might look like in terms of the architecture. So if you're a GitHub user, great, one of many. So in terms of integration with GitHub, we have a GitHub app, we have GitHub Actions, we have the integration through also the Copilot extension, if you so wish. But the story behind that is all underpinned by Octopus. It's the exact same story, just different use model. So that's the idea. All right. let's go ahead and jump into a demo. This is my favorite part, is where you basically kick the tires. So let's jump back into Octopus and take a look at what Octopus looks like. So it's a very simple example. This is my personal instance here that I do a lot of demos with. You can see here on the left-hand side, we have a bunch of items that I can choose to select from. So these are things like, my projects. I can manage my infrastructure, etc. In the center part here, this is your dashboard. This is where you see things like your existing projects. So I have my projects here on the left-hand side. Up here at the top, across the top here, I have my different environments. These are environments that you'll establish yourself. They are basically virtual environments. They are named only, and then you can qualify or designate certain targets for those environments. And then in the middle here, you get the status of each project, its deployment status relative to each environment. So here you can say I have 001 in development, and for example, 002 here is in production. Just to give you an example of what this might look like. Looking at a more complicated example, and of course we support dark mode as well. We have here another example where we have a bunch of different types of projects listed on the left-hand side, our environments across the top, and the different versions of those projects listed here in part of the dashboard. So it's a single pane of glass, quick glance and go sort of desktop or dashboard that allows you to get a sense of what deployments have been successful, what haven't, etc., and allows you to manage them very quickly and easily. From here, let's go ahead and jump into a project. So we'll jump into this one called Hello Octopus, for example, and let's jump into creating a deployment process. So a deployment process is really the lifeblood of Octopus. It's where you define the series of steps to do a deployment. So a deployment process is where you basically wire up a series of steps, and these are steps that are built out of the box in Octopus to define a deployment. So a deployment might be things like, hey, notify some folks via Slack, push some packages over here, do an update on the database over there, and then execute a script command to, say, update a server or a cloud instance, etc., and that's your deployment. So the way you do this is you define this through a series of steps. And so when you jump into the process editor here, you'll notice that we have our steps categorized based on their function. So I can choose any number of steps that are available here that are built out of the box. So I have these categories here that I can choose from. So I can use script steps here. I can use steps that incorporate packages, for example. If I'm more interested in looking at what I want to do in terms of cloud native deployment, I can utilize those as well. So I have AWS, I have Azure, I have GCP, for example. And if there's a step that isn't built out of the box with Octopus, don't worry. We have over 500 community steps as well that you can use to target any number of scenarios. So just scrolling through some of these, you can see these are various integrations that the community has built in for Octopus itself. So there's any number of steps that you can use as part of this process. Inside the process editor here, you'll notice I have this well here, which defines my series of steps that I'm executing for a deployment. So here I have a script step. This is actually our most popular step. This is the one step that allows people to take the wheel and drive themselves, so to speak. But there are other steps that I can add to this as well. So let's assume that in this deployment process, one step that I may want to do, for example, is execute a script. And of course, this is a contrived example, but you can imagine there might be something more complicated going on here. Let's go ahead and add a step here. And let's say the next one I want to do is utilize a manual intervention. So a manual intervention is where I am actually pausing the execution of the deployment to get verification or approval from a human. So when you take a look at Octopus for the first time, you see all these options here. It can look a bit daunting, right? I get that. It's a lot of knobs and buttons to process. Know that every step has a series of conditions that are meta conditions in a sense. It allows you to find things like when the step runs, do you want to try to retry if upon failure? Do you want to specify any timeouts, etc.? These are sort of meta conditions that you define for the step itself. And the reason why this is defined across most steps is because they are consistent when utilizing in the context of a deployment process. Conditions are those that are sort of adherent to the deployment execution. Now, the ones that are going to be relevant to the step itself are defined in this subsection here. So you'll see this across every step that you define in a deployment process. You'll have a section here for defining these things. So a manual intervention is basically a step that says, hey, go grab a human, a person, typically an admin or something like that, and get them to approve this step to continue the deployment process. So in a sense, it's like if you're a developer, it's kind of like a breakpoint. Although in that sense, you're not in a debugging session, but it's kind of akin to a breakpoint. Just halt execution and wait for approval to continue. So a manual intervention allows you to do that. Now you might want to ask yourself, why would I have a manual intervention? Well, it might be if there's a series of database changes that I'm doing. Let's say I'm doing a schema diff, and I'm going to go and can perform a bunch of deltas against a database. Maybe I want a DBA to review the schema difference, just to do a sanity check on that. Or it might be something whereby I wait for a human to proceed because of a time scale or something like that I'm concerned about. That is something that I can add as well. There are other steps as well that you can add. There are steps related to Slack, for example, or Teams. So this is, again, bringing humans into the process itself. You can utilize these integrations and allow people to get notified when certain deployment steps have occurred. Taking a look at a more elaborate example here, so jumping into this samples instance. By the way, you can hit this samples instance yourself. This is at samples.octopus.app, and you can explore this at your own leisure if you so wish. But looking at this one here, for example, oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. That one is only runbooks. I'll talk about runbooks in a second. So jumping over to this one here, which is our Octo Pet Shop product service. If we take a look at the deployment process for this, it's going to outline a series of steps that look somewhat similar to what I was describing earlier. So here what we have is a deployment process that invokes a Slack step. So this is a notification via Slack saying to our DBAs who are well-defined, hey, there's something happening here against our database. Let's go ahead and notify our DBAs of a pending approval. Let's also email the business owners of this approval. And then we'll run a customized step. So let's assume that we're doing a change to a cluster. And so we'll run the tool customize to do that. And then we'll have these conditional steps here at the bottom, which will notify teams whether a deployment succeeded or if it failed. So these are based on conditions that you can define accordingly. And those conditions are defined as part of the step itself. So there's lots of ways in which you can tweak this for sure. All right. So taking a look at our deployment process, there's lots of ways in which you can execute this. If we jump back here to our previous example, let me go ahead and just remove this. And we'll just see how this actually executes. So here I have a script step that is executing against a series of targets that I have defined with this tag. I've defined a source inline here. I can also define my source to come from a different location. So one of the things that we integrate with is Git, obviously. But we can also load this this script from a package that we have integrated. So a package is like a file. It's typically an archive, like a zip archive or a tarball or a jar file, things like that. We can actually pull those down not only from our local repository in Octopus. So Octopus has a repository, a package repository that we host internally. Or you can get this from a series of external feeds that you can define. Those feeds can include Artifactory, NuGet server, for example. These and other locations you can use as part of that. But here I've defined it as a inline script. So let's go ahead and create a release. You'll notice here that I'm 002 because I've actually executed this previously. But a release is nothing more than just a snapshot of the deployment that I wish to run. Now, the reason why this is important is because a release will allow me to define all the things that go into a deployment process itself. So all the packages, the Git resources, the variables that I may define, and it creates a snapshot of those values. The reason why we do that is because you want a safe and sane way of actually having capabilities associated with this, like rollback. So by creating a snapshot and persisting those values as part of that snapshot in the form of a release, you get a consistent deployment pattern each and every time. And so you can see if I go and choose to deploy this to production, I've given another option, to development, I meant to say. I have a number of options here. I can define when I want this deployment to occur, what priority I want to provide, whether or not I want to choose to exclude any steps as part of this. So I can choose to opt out of certain steps for this individual deployment, which is a nice feature. There are many other knobs and buttons you can tweak as well. Let's go ahead and issue the deployment. And notice that when we do this, it will actually give us a running task log, excuse me, of the deployment. So this is speaking to the auditing capabilities of Octopus itself. So we get to ask the question, who did the deployment? When did they do the deployment? What changes were impacted based on that deployment? And so by providing that capability, we give traceability. This is really good for auditing purposes. Now you can stream these logs to a remote service like Sumo if you want, or you can utilize any arbitrary sort of thing that utilizes open telemetry as well. So we have a generic provider for that. But in this context here, we're just doing it all locally within Octopus itself. So down here at the bottom, you can see there's my hello world statement that I utilized in my script step. So here I can simply see that that's recurring. So we've successfully done the deployment. If I go back to my dashboard, there's 002 now in development as part of this deployment. Now, if I so wish, I can then promote this to something like staging, for example. So I can choose to now deploy this version to staging and click on deploy if I so wish. And now I'm promoting that to staging. For rollbacks, I can certainly simply just roll back. It's built into the out of the box for rollbacks as part of this process. But it now gives me a safe and sane way of managing these deployments very, very nicely. And so, as I said before, with a deployment process, which is really at the heart of what you're doing here with Octopus, it gives you a means of defining these things quickly and easily. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what you saw. So inside the deployment process itself, which is really, again, at the heart of everything here, you saw a visual representation of the deployment process. So this is one of the nice things that is provided out of the box with Octopus. This includes any conditions that you may have, as well as any child steps that you have. So something I didn't have a chance to show you was parallel execution through child steps. You can also do parallel execution of peer steps. So you can have steps that are run at the same time as part of a process. Everything is built on top of Markdown in terms of notes, and this is great because it allows you to articulate what a deployment process is to your team. You may have a lot of teams using Octopus, and so you want to make sure you can articulate what your deployment process is doing. We have the ability to do parallel step execution, as I mentioned before, as well as providing environment labels on these steps. What this allows you to do is basically define which steps will run on what environments you have defined. And the reason why this is nice is because you can have certain steps that only run in certain conditions. Those are scopes, and those are defined on an environment basis. So a good example of this might be that if you want to deploy to production, you have to invoke manual intervention. You have to have a human involved because that's a sort of privileged operation, if you will, in terms of a deployment. You only want to have someone approve a deployment to production. So therefore, a manual intervention step will only run against the production environment variable or label, excuse me. So that's something that you can specify and have these sort of conditional logic executing as part of that. Some other things to mention as part of Octopus itself. This is sort of the high level things to bear about Octopus. So we provide a reliable and risk-free deployment environment with built-in rollback capabilities. This is super, super important to understand that you can deploy on Friday. It's okay. You can deploy on Saturday. You can deploy on Sunday. You should be able to deploy on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday because you have a tool that allows you to do this in a safe and sane way. And if things go wrong, you can roll back. And so that's the advantage there, is that you don't want to have to deal with these blackout periods of deployments. Giving a tool like Octopus as part of your pipeline, the ability to do this will help you do deployments with confidence. In addition to that, you can utilize the ops of the DevOps side of the equation. So out of the box, Octopus has a feature called runbooks. And what this allows you to do is basically perform release management capabilities. So your ops teams can use this to perform all kinds of operations against databases, against websites, etc. So you have a lot of opportunity there to do these operations in concert with your deployment processes. So these things might be typically things like routine tasks or even emergency operations. And the reason why this is nice is you can persist a lot of values you may need to perform these tasks, things like passwords, things like secrets, etc. These are the keys you need to perform these operation tasks, obviously. And you can simply persist those and have them executed without leaking those details anywhere because they're sensitive values, but you'll be able to provide the RBAC controls around this, the role-based access security controls around this, so that people can execute those safely and sanely. So if someone has to, run a backup of a database or even reboot a server, they can do so as articulated through runbooks. If you're working with containers at all, if you're targeting Kubernetes, you can utilize our built-in support there for things like Helm, or you can use Customize. We also have YAML support built in out of the box. So there's lots of capabilities you can use there as integration with those capabilities there. Oh, it turns out we have a question here. Let me just make sure we answer these questions. So we have a question here. How exactly does rollback work with Octopus for deployment on clouds or custom scripts? So the way this works is we allow you to auto roll back 2 releases past. So you can roll back, if you want to do something previous to that, it just requires a config change. But we automatically track the changes, and then you can simply roll back and push. That's why a snapshot's so important. So we actually propagate back the change that came previously. So it gives you that rollback capability to the previous version you had in your previous release. Now, obviously, if you had version 1 not using Octopus and then version 2 using Octopus, you can't roll back to version 1 because those changes wouldn't be articulated in Octopus. But it is something, if you have a release specified in Octopus, then you have the ability to roll back automatically as part of that. Great. So again, if you're just working with containers, it's really, really easy and nice. Now, one feature I want to mention here is support for a feature we have called tenants or multi-tenancy. So tenants are a really, really powerful way of defining your deployment processes without having to duplicate it over and over again if you're doing a deployment to a variety of different target types based on things like their geography, for example. So this is something that a lot of our more mature customers who use Octopus for a long period of time really love. This is like their number one feature they talk about all the time. Once they have a couple of years of experience with Octopus under their belt, they talk consistently about how much they love support for multi-tenancy. And in fact, we're the only deployment tool that supports it. So multi-tenancy is this ability to basically define a deployment process once and then have it defined across a variety of tenants. So tenants can be defined based on the criteria that you define. But they typically are things like if you're defining a web app, might be the geography that web app is serving to, or the type of internal taxonomy you have defined for your app types. So things like if I'm running a pet shop, for example, it might be the different clinics or the pet shops that I have around my geography, for example. So this is a really, really powerful capability. It's built in as part of Octopus itself. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, risk, governance, compliance, all of that is in check. So you have the ability of doing full auditing. You can stream that audit log directly if you wish to Octopus, or you can serve it out through a variety of means to third-party providers as well, including Sumo, Splunk, etc. We also do integrate with other third parties. I mentioned integrations before. We have a really rich integration story. So we know that, Octopus isn't living in a silo. It has to work in concert with other tools because it's going to be part of a pipeline. And so you can actually have Octopus serve at the behest or as, as an agent for ServiceNow, so to speak. So ServiceNow or things like Jira Service Management can serve as an arbiter of control for your deployments. So in the case of ServiceNow, for example, you may wait for a change request to come through, and you can configure this very easily out of the box with Octopus. There's an integration directly in Octopus for this. And so ServiceNow will approve the change request, and then that will flow down to Octopus and automatically do the deployment as part of that scenario. Really, really powerful stuff. All right, let's jump back into a demo here and talk a little bit about integration with CI. So in all of these contexts, it's been very hands-on, very manual. So I've defined kind of like, what it would look like from a setup procedure perspective. But if you're utilizing utilizing Octopus in the concert in context with something like GitHub Actions, for example, we have to look at an automation context here. So let me just get rid of my head so you can. All right, there we go. So you can see the screen better. So in GitHub, there's a folder, a special folder called .github/workflows, where you define all your workflows associated with your project, things like builds, etc. And so here I have a YAML file defined for this. Now, this is .NET Core that we're targeting, but it could be any type of programming language. It really doesn't matter. But typically what you'll see in a GitHub Actions context is you'll see a lot of build and tests that run at the start, and then deployment left at the end. For integration with Octopus, you can utilize any number of our GitHub Actions that we have built in. So here's an example of pushing packages to Octopus. This is using the push package action. We also have a create release action as well. These and other actions you can find up on the GitHub Marketplace. So if you go to the GitHub Marketplace, which is at github.com/marketplace, and you do a search for Octopus, you'll find all the actions that we have built into GitHub itself that you can take advantage of. As I said before, we have integrations for pretty much anything. Excuse me. We also have integration with GitHub via a GitHub app. So you can download and install this as part of your GitHub enterprise experience or through GitHub proper. You could also incorporate GitHub through the, Octopus through the GitHub Copilot through our extension as well. So these and other sort of capabilities we have built in GitHub itself, and you can integrate with GitHub very seamlessly as part of this development experience, which is great. So taking a look at other examples here. So we mentioned GitHub Actions. We also have integration with, for example, Azure DevOps. I'm using the old pipeline view here just to kind of show the pretty icons here. So you can see if this was in YAML, it would look pretty much the same as GitHub Actions. But we have these steps that you can utilize for doing things like push package, create release, etc., deploy release, etc. So we have integration directly with Azure DevOps. We have integration with JetBrains, namely TeamCity. In fact, we're the #1 plugin for TeamCity. If you go to the JetBrains Marketplace, you'll find us there. We have integrations with BuildKite. We have integrations with Jenkins. We have integrations with any number of CI solutions that are out there. So definitely worth mentioning as part of this scenario. And these are integrations that you can easily wire up in an automation context. In addition to that, if you're at all curious, you can certainly utilize Octopus in a number of different means. One of the ways in which you can utilize this is through our CLI. So if we take a look at the CLI, which we have, which is called Octopus, of course, no CLI would be complete without a cool looking emoji. So we have our CLI here. This allows you to integrate scenarios that are based on automation context through our CLI. You can perform any number of commands against any number of things in Octopus itself, which is great. Yet another scenario that you can use Octopus in this context. So there's many automation contexts that you can support going forward as part of Octopus. And that provides a context for which you're using CI or any other type of tool. Great. All right. So in this webinar, you saw and learned a few things. Hopefully you were able to understand everything. So I showed you a little bit about how Octopus works and why you might want to consider using it. We talked about some Octopus fundamentals, namely deployment processes, projects, releases, etc. There are many other terms you need to know, but hopefully this gives you a good start, a good bootstrap into your learning process around Octopus. I showed you how to create a deployment process from scratch. That's where you set up a series of steps and you perform a deployment as part of that. And then I showed you how you can trigger a deployment process through a number of different means. We have steps for any number of CI solutions or projects that are out there, which is typically the way in which a lot of folks build their pipelines, which is CI out. You can certainly trigger a deployment through other means as well. There are many other capabilities that Octopus supports. We have a feature called ARC as well, which is automatic release creation. What that does is it basically detects new changes that occur against packages and will automatically deploy them if you so wish. You can execute a deployment through our CLI. We also have a very rich API that you can target. So we have a number of service endpoints that you can invoke directly if you so wish. We have clients for pretty much any language you can think of. We have a TypeScript client, we have a Ruby client, we have a Go client. So you can certainly use those. We have a .NET client Excel as well. So you can do anything you want against Octopus through any number of different means. Any type of automation context you can think of, we support. This was always meant to be a short webinar, so we're up to 38 minutes now on the clock. Here are some links for you to check out if you so wish. Don't forget that this is recorded and available after the fact up on our YouTube channel, which is listed here. If you have any questions, you can email me as well. And in that sense, I'll just go ahead and make sure we answer some questions here. So we have another question here. Does multi-tenancy also mean we can use the same deployment on different clouds with just a change in credentials? Effectively, yes. Deployment processes are independent of their targets. They don't they don't they don't we don't care so much about targets until later on. They are simply mapped to environments. So deployment targets are independent essentially of a deployment process in a large part. Now that's dependent upon what you're trying to do. So obviously, if you're trying to do configs or things like that, it really depends on what you're trying to do. But targets themselves, you'll define. So if we take a look at an example here, I'll just jump back in here. This wasn't part of the demo, but I'll just show you anyway. So here you can see here's our dashboard. This is essentially for a project itself. I can define a whole bunch of things here. But if I want to take a look at my targets, for example, here's where I define my targets, and I'll define a deployment target. Let me get rid of the question here. Sorry, I'm still answering the question, but I just want to show you guys the full screen so you can see everything I'm doing. So here's where I add my deployment targets. Now, deployment targets, the way they're defined is you'll define them utilizing a technology we have called Tentacle. Tentacle is the way in which we define, it's like a little agent that sits on your deployment target and allows us to run commands, which are part of your deployment process on each of those targets. So out of the box, we support Kubernetes, Linux, Windows, Mac. Here's Azure, for example, AWS. We have this thing called Cloud Region as well. These are deployment targets where you want to set up an agent for it to listen and do work, basically. So you'll set these things up as deployment targets and then map them to environments to do deployments. So it really, answering your question, getting back to your question here about multi-tenancy, it really depends on how you define your deployment process. Essentially, the way you'll define this as part of tenants is you'll map them here. So you'll add a tenant here. You'll give it a name, for example. So let's just say, call this AWS and click Save. I can then map, I can manage these against a set of tenants. I can connect this to a project and then define a whole bunch of things associated with this. I can define things like variables that are only specific to tenants. I can define tasks associated with tenants, etc. And I can also manage these things accordingly. If I take a look at an example here where we have a bunch of tenants. Again, this samples instance I'm showing you here is one that you can definitely kick the tires yourself if you so wish. We do have an example here that shows tenants, and this is just because there's lots of tenants here rather than watching me create a bunch of them from scratch. So here's our tenants view here that shows us, let me again get rid of the question and give you full screen. So here's a bunch of tenants that have been defined. I have 13 tenants here. You'll notice that each one of these has a tag or tags that I can define. That's important because tenant tags give us a flexibility of mapping. I can also get a mapping against projects, but I can also utilize these in the context of environments. So we get this nice Venn diagram of tenants to tags to environments, etc., that allows me to define these things. In addition to that, when I define a tenant as well, I can map certain variables against that tenant. Now, I don't know if I have any. Okay, I do have tenant variables associated with this. I can certainly use these in the context of the project, or I could use the ones that are defined as part of this this project itself. I don't have any here that are utilized as part of this, but if I did, they would show up here. So tenants are a really powerful mechanism that allows me to define these in context with a deployment process. If we jump back here to our projects here, and we take a look at an example like our vet clinic, for example, and we take a look at the deployment process itself will map to environments through these tags. So these tags here are defined as part of this. But as far as tenants are concerned, that is where I can actually do these as part of my release strategy. So if I take a look at the dashboard here, for example, this is one where I have tenants defined. You can see I have my tenants listed on the left-hand side here and my environments at the top. This is different than the project view you saw earlier, where I have projects listed on the left and environments at the top. So here I'm doing this in terms of tenants rather than in terms of projects. So it gives me that more granular control. It's a term that everyone uses in this industry, but it does give you that control at a tenant level for that capability. So it's a really nice capability. You'll often see this a lot with more mature usage of Octopus. A lot of customers start to utilize this, and then they absolutely love this feature because it gives him rich control over where the deployments go on a tenant by tenant basis. Awesome. There's a question here. Can you deploy smart contracts? I'll have to scratch. This is definitely testing my knowledge. Smart contracts, again, I'll have to remind myself what these are. I know I've heard this term before. Sorry, I don't remember what smart contracts are. Sorry, I'm blanking on this one. I'll say maybe. Sorry, I know it's not answering your question. But I'll have to look into that. So I'll take a look and see if that is the case. All right, just checking the Q&A here, see if there are any questions left. If not, bring up the slide here, which provides the details for you to check out. Please don't forget, we have our website. You can sign up for a trial today, octopus.com, sign up for a free trial. You can either download the bits yourself and install them, or you can sign up for a cloud trial. I would recommend just grabbing a cloud instance. It's the easiest way to get started. It's hosted, it's easy to use, etc. You can check out our YouTube channel, which is at /octopusdeploy on youtube.com. Great place for you to check out all our videos. We publish there all the time. And then if you have any questions, maybe someone can apply that question to my email address about smart contracts. I'll have to look at that. Feel free to leverage that. All right, just looking to see if there are any other questions. I don't see any here. All right, with that, well, let's go ahead and wrap up the webinar. Really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you very much. We do these every month. Don't forget to check them out at /webinars up on octopus.com. And until next time, happy deployments, everyone. Take care.